It was a hot August afternoon, the kind of stifling heat that clung to the air and made sweat trickle down your skin. In a simple house in the suburbs of Atlanta, Carol was alone. Her husband, a white man with blue eyes and blonde hair, wasn't home. He spent more and more time away, as if there was something keeping him distant from what should have been his home. But Carol didn't mind. She was tired of trying to understand what was going on in Will's head, the man she had married just over 3 years ago. She was about to give birth, and the anxiety rising within her was like a soft fire that burned quietly, but didn't stop being uncomfortable. It was her first child, and the love she felt for him grew with each passing day. She could feel the little body moving inside her, a mix of emotions, both fear and silent joy, as though life was about to truly begin. That child represented everything she had always dreamed of: a new chance, a new hope. But what she didn't know was that the future wouldn't be so simple. When Will came home that night, he seemed different. His posture was stiff, and he avoided looking directly at her, as if he feared some confrontation. He didn't say anything when he saw her in the living room, gently caressing her belly. Carol tried to ignore the uncomfortable sensation, but knew deep down that things were about to change. "Are you okay?" he asked, almost automatically, as if just going through the motions. "I'm fine," she replied with a tired smile, "just waiting for the right moment." The baby could come any time. The conversation ended there. Will moved to the other side of the room, and Carol felt the silence stretching between them. It was a strange feeling. He used to care for her so much. Now there was something else in the air, something she couldn't identify, but that made her feel as though she wasn't with the same man she married anymore. When the contractions started, they were soft, almost imperceptible. Carol was lying on the bed, waiting for the right moment to go to the hospital. Will sat on the edge of the bed, looking at her with a closed expression. Carol tried not to think about her uncertainties, but she couldn't help it. Something was wrong. "Are you going to come with me?" she asked, trying to force some lightness into her voice. He looked at her, hesitated for a moment, and then said, I don't think I can go today. I have something to take care of at work. It's urgent." His voice was wavering, as if he was trying to convince himself of something. She stayed silent for a few seconds, feeling a pang in her chest. What was happening with Will? He seemed so distant, so absent. But with some effort, Carol got up from the bed and grabbed her bag, determined to go on alone. On the way to the hospital, her thoughts were a jumble. She never imagined she'd have to deal with this loneliness at such an important moment in her life. The love she felt for the man she had dedicated the best years of her youth to seem to be fading with each passing day. But right now, all she wanted was to hold her baby in her arms, feel that warmth on her chest, and finally start building the life she had always dreamed of. When they arrived at the hospital, Carol was quickly taken to the delivery room. She was alone, but didn't care anymore. What mattered now was the child she was about to give birth to. The contractions became stronger and more regular, and she breathed deeply through each one, reminding herself of what she'd always heard about childbirth. It was hard, but in the end, it would be worth it. When the baby finally arrived, the doctor paused, and Carol felt a tension in the air. She didn't know why, but something didn't feel right. The baby was crying, and Carol smiled when she heard it. But her smile froze when the doctor looked at her with an expression that wasn't exactly joy, but surprise, maybe even apprehension. "Would you like to see your baby?" the doctor asked, still maintaining a professional tone, but with something strange in her eyes. "Of course," Carol replied, her anxiety growing. She wanted to see her baby's face more than anything in the world. The doctor carefully handed the baby to Carol's arms. She looked at the small face with closed eyes, wrinkled skin, and little trembling hands. It was everything she had hoped for until she looked more closely and noticed something that made her freeze. The baby, who should have had light skin like Will, was black. The baby's dark skin was in stark contrast to her own, which was brown, but she never imagined the baby would be so deeply black. She felt a knot in her throat. Something wasn't right. She looked at the baby again, and this time the feeling of something wrong seemed real. But before she could react, the doctor made an expression Carol didn't know how to interpret, and left without saying a word. Alone, Carol held her baby more tightly, trying to process everything that had happened in just a few hours. What was going on? Where was Will? And how did the baby have such dark skin? She didn't know, but a feeling of discomfort took over her. Something was about to change in ways she couldn't control. The hours passed in a blur. Carol sat in her hospital bed, holding her newborn son in her arms, still in a state of disbelief. The room felt sterile and cold, despite the warmth of her baby against her chest. Her mind kept racing, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing made sense. The baby, so perfect in his tiny form with dark skin, was a stark contrast to everything she had known, to everything she had imagined. It didn't add up. Where was Will? He hadn't shown up. Not even a text, not even a call. Carol's stomach twisted with unease. She knew something was off, and the longer she waited, the heavier the silence became. There was a faint sense of betrayal, a shadow that hung over her every thought. Her husband, the man who had been so excited about becoming a father, was absent in the most crucial moment. She glanced down at her son again, trying to ignore the unease growing inside her. He was beautiful, with deep brown eyes and soft curls already starting to form on his head. He was perfect, just the way she had always imagined her baby would be. But something deep inside told her that this wasn't how things were supposed to be. She should have been excited, happy, but instead, the joy of motherhood was clouded by confusion and doubt. After what felt like an eternity, Carol finally reached for her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed Will's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. She hung up, trying to calm herself, but the knot in her stomach only grew tighter. She tried calling again and again. No answer. A wave of frustration surged through her. What was going on? Will had never been this distant before. He had always been supportive, always there when she needed him. But now, at the most important time in their lives, he was unreachable. Carol didn't know what to think. She needed answers. The doubt gnawed at her like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. Was he really at work? Was he just avoiding her? Or was there something more to it, something that she wasn't ready to face? Minutes later, a nurse entered the room, checking on her and the baby. She smiled at Carol, her presence a small comfort, but Carol could barely muster a smile in return. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Thomas?" the nurse asked, glancing at the baby in Carol's arms. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" Carol nodded, but the words didn't come. She wasn't sure what she was feeling anymore. The nurse seemed to sense the change in the air, her smile faltering slightly. "Is there anything you need, anything you'd like to discuss?" the nurse asked gently, her voice offering a lifeline in the midst of Carol's swirling thoughts. Carol shook her head. "No, I'm fine. Just waiting for my husband to get here." The nurse hesitated, clearly unsure if she should say anything. But then, after a brief moment, she spoke again. "I understand. Sometimes things don't go as planned. But everything will work out. Just give it time." Carol looked up at her, her eyes narrowing. The nurse seemed so calm, so reassuring, but Carol couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her. "I'm sorry," Carol said suddenly, her voice cracking. "I just don't understand. Why is my son like this?" The question came out before Carol could stop herself. The nurse blinked, taken aback, and Carol instantly regretted it. She shouldn't have said that. But the words were out there, hanging in the air like an uncomfortable truth. The nurse gave her a sympathetic smile, her face softening. "Mrs. Thomas, sometimes these things just happen. Genetics are complicated, and sometimes a child's traits don't follow what you expect. But trust me, your son is perfect. He's a beautiful baby." Carol nodded, but the weight of the words genetics and complicated rang hollow in her mind. Something inside her felt like she was being placated, as though the nurse wasn't saying everything she knew. But before she could ask another question, the nurse excused herself, leaving Carol alone with her thoughts. Her phone buzzed again, and Carol's heart skipped a beat. This time it was a message from Will. The text was brief. "I'm sorry, I can't come right now. I'll explain later. Take care of yourself and the baby. I'll see you soon." Carol read the message 3 times, trying to understand its meaning, but the more she read, the more confused she became. Will wasn't coming. Not tonight, not even to see his own son. The sense of abandonment deepened, and a terrible ache settled in Carol's chest. Her mind raced. What was going on? She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had happened, and it wasn't just about the baby's skin color. The more she thought about Will's behavior, the more she realized that it wasn't just a simple matter of genetics or coincidence. There was something deeper, something that went beyond what she could understand. She clutched her son tighter to her chest, as though he could provide the answers she so desperately sought. But the baby only cooed in his sleep, unaware of the storm swirling inside his mother's heart. The next morning, Carol woke up to the soft sound of her baby crying. She was still in the hospital room, and the sun had barely begun to rise, casting a warm golden light over the sterile walls. She sat up in bed, her body aching from the exhaustion of labor, but her mind sharp and restless. Her son, still in her arms, had been peacefully sleeping for a few hours, but now he was awake, his little face scrunching up in distress. Carol gently rocked him, trying to soothe him with soft whispers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her mind was clouded with questions. Will's absence still weighed heavily on her, and the more she thought about his text from the night before, the more confused she became. He had promised to explain, but he hadn't. The silence felt deafening. The weight of the unknown was like a heavy fog, clouding her thoughts, making it hard to focus on the joy of becoming a mother. But even as she felt the pang of disappointment and betrayal. She couldn't deny her deep, unshakable love for her baby boy. He was everything to her. And yet she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she was being kept in the dark. Her phone buzzed again, breaking the stillness of the moment. Carol glanced down, her heart skipping a beat when she saw it was from Will. She quickly opened the message. "I need to see you. We need to talk. I'm coming by later. Please don't tell anyone about the baby yet." The words sent a chill down her spine. Don't tell anyone about the baby? Why would he ask her not to share the news? Was he ashamed of their child? The thought stung more than she expected. She felt her chest tighten, the ache in her heart deepening. Will was asking her to hide her son. It didn't make sense. For a moment, Carol sat there, holding her baby, staring at the phone in her hands. The world seemed to have shifted beneath her feet, and she was no longer sure where she stood. She wanted to confront Will, demand answers, but she also knew that something inside her was holding her back. Was it fear? Or was it simply that part of her, despite everything, still clung to the hope that things would work out? As if on cue, the nurse came in to check on her, a warm smile on her face as she made her rounds. Carol greeted her with a strained smile, her thoughts swirling, but the nurse didn't seem to notice anything unusual. "How's our little one doing today?" the nurse asked cheerfully. "He's fine," Carol replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just a little fussy. I think he's hungry." The nurse nodded and checked the baby's vitals before offering Carol some advice on feeding schedules and rest. But her mind wasn't focused on the nurse's words. It was on Will's message and the knot that was forming in her stomach. "I'll be back in a little while to check on you again," the nurse said, and Carol simply nodded, barely acknowledging her departure. Once the nurse was gone, Carol was left in the quiet of the room again, the silence pressing down on her. She looked at her son, who was now contentedly feeding, and felt a rush of love. But that love was now tangled with an overwhelming sense of fear. What was Will hiding? Why didn't he want anyone to know about their child? As the hours passed, Carol tried to distract herself, but her thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. She couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in her chest. She had always believed that the truth would eventually come out, but now she wasn't sure she was prepared for what that truth might be. Finally, around mid-afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Carol's heart skipped a beat, and she stood up quickly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She opened the door to find Will standing there, his expression tense, his eyes avoiding hers. He looked different, distant, cold, almost like a stranger. He hadn't changed into anything more formal. His shirt was wrinkled, and his hair was unkempt. He didn't look like the man she had fallen in love with. "Will," Carol said softly, her voice a mixture of relief and frustration, "where have you been? Why didn't you come last night? You told me you would—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice flat. "I'm sorry. I had to handle some things. But we need to talk in private." Carol's heart sank. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She nodded, silently stepping aside to let him in. She didn't say anything as he walked past her, his gaze never meeting hers. They sat down on the edge of the bed, the air thick with tension. Carol held her baby close to her chest, trying to calm herself, but the silence between them was suffocating. "I'm glad you're here," she said, trying to break the ice. But why didn't you come last night? Why didn't you see him? Our son?" Will ran a hand through his hair, a sign of agitation, and sighed heavily. "Carol, listen to me," he said, his voice suddenly softer, though still distant. "We can't tell anyone about him, not yet. Not until I figure things out." The words hit Carol like a slap. "What do you mean, not yet?" she asked, her voice rising. "What you mean we can't tell anyone? This is our son. Will, why can't we tell people about him?" He looked at her then, his eyes filled with something Carol couldn't quite read. "I don't want anyone to know, not until we know the truth. Just trust me." Carol felt a surge of anger and confusion. She wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but something in her gut told her to stay calm, to listen. But the more she tried to understand, the more lost she felt. "Trust you?" she repeated. "Will, you're not making any sense. What truth? Why are you asking me to hide our son? I thought we were a family." Will's expression hardened, and for the first time he met her gaze directly. "Carol, I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to protect all of us. Please just trust me." But as he spoke, Carol's instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. She didn't know what it was yet, but she was beginning to sense that the truth, when it came, would not be what she wanted to hear. Carol stared at Will, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. He wasn't acting like himself, his usual warmth and reassurance, replaced by a cold detachment that was nearly unrecognizable. Her hands clenched around the baby, instinctively pulling him closer, as if to shield him from something unseen. Something that Carol couldn't yet put her finger on, but knew was there, lurking just beneath the surface. "Protect us?" Carol repeated, her voice barely a whisper, yet it was filled with disbelief and a rising sense of dread. "What do you mean by that?" "Protect us from what, Will?" He sighed again, running a hand through his hair in frustration. His eyes were dark, not with anger, but with something more dangerous guilt, and the guilt made Carol's heart race with fear. She had never seen him like this before. Will had always been her rock, the one person she could count on no matter what. But now, as he sat in front of her, it felt like the man she had married was slipping away. "I don't know how to explain this to you," he said, his voice tight, almost breaking. I don't know how to tell you, but I'm scared. I'm scared for you, for me, for all of us." Carol's mind whirled with questions, each one more confusing than the last. She wanted to demand answers, to force him to tell her everything, but she knew deep down that it wasn't going to be that simple. Will wasn't the type to just open up, especially not about something as serious as this. Whatever he was hiding, whatever truth he was protecting her from, it was big, bigger than anything she had ever imagined. Scared of what? Carol's voice cracked, the fear she had been trying to suppress now creeping into her tone. "Will, this isn't like you. You're scaring me. Just tell me what's going on. I deserve to know." Will looked at her, and for a brief moment their eyes locked, but it was as though he couldn't bring himself to speak the words that were choking him. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, he looked away, as though trying to find the right words but coming up short. Carol's frustration boiled over. She stood up, her knees weak from the exhaustion of both the delivery and the emotional roller coaster she had been on. She paced around the room, the baby still in her arms, her mind racing with possibilities. What was it? What had happened? Why had Will been so distant? And why was he now asking her to hide their son? To keep him a secret? "Will, please," she said, her voice growing louder. "You're scaring me. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep waiting for you to tell me something I should already know. I need you to be honest with me, now." Will stood up abruptly, his hand rubbing his forehead as if trying to clear the fog from his thoughts. He didn't answer right away. The silence between them grew thick, suffocating, until it felt as though the walls were closing in. Carol's pulse raced, her heart thundering in her chest. She didn't know what he was about to say, but everything in her told her it wasn't going to be good. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible, but the words hit Carol like a slap. The baby isn't mine." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a moment Carol didn't understand what he had just said. She stared at him, her brain unable to process the meaning of his words. She had heard him, but it didn't make sense. It couldn't. What are you talking about?" Her voice faltered, the question barely leaving her mouth before she felt the crushing weight of it all. "What do you mean, he isn't yours?" Will looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "Carol, I'm not the father. The baby, he's not mine. I'm sorry. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to tell you the truth." The words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, and Carol felt her knees give way beneath her. She sank onto the bed, her breath catching in her throat as a wave of nausea overtook her. She couldn't breathe. The room spun around her, and the baby in her arms, so innocent, so perfect, seemed like a weight she could no longer carry. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "If he's not yours, then whose is he?" Will ran a hand through his hair again, frustration and guilt battling on his face. "I'm sorry, I never meant for you to find out this way, but I'm not the father, Carol. The truth is, I don't know who the father is, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what will happen if people find out." Carol felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her world, which had already been shaken to its core, now seemed to be crumbling around her. She had been so sure, so certain, that everything was as it should be. But now the foundation she had built her life on was nothing more than sand. "I need you to explain," Carol managed to say, her voice hoarse, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I need you to tell me how this happened. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Will's face crumpled as he spoke, as if the weight of his own guilt was too much to bear. "I didn't know how to tell you, Carol. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what people would think. And when I saw the baby, I thought, maybe it wouldn't matter. But now I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." Carol's mind was in chaos, her heart broken into pieces as the truth settled in. Her husband, the man she had loved and trusted, was telling her that their child was not his, and the silence that had followed that revelation was louder than any words could ever be. For the first time in her life, Carol didn't know who to trust. She looked down at her son, so small, so innocent, and realized that he, too, was caught in a web of lies and secrets that no one should have to bear. Her heart ached for him, for everything he was about to face in a world that could be so cruel. She felt utterly alone. Carol sat in stunned silence, her thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion, Will's confession echoed in her ears like a distant, hollow sound that she couldn't quite make sense of. "The baby isn't mine." Those words repeated over and over in her mind, but the more she tried to grasp their meaning, the more elusive they became. She couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't find the clarity she so desperately needed. The baby in her arms, so small, so fragile, seemed both like an anchor and an ocean, pulling her under with its weight. How could Will do this to her? How could he hide the truth for so long? And yet, how could she be so blind to the signs? She had never questioned the paternity of her child. She had believed with every fiber of her being that he was Will's, that they had built their family together. But now, everything was shattered. And the most painful part was that Will seemed almost relieved to be free of the responsibility. He stood at the window, his back to her, as though avoiding her gaze. His posture was tense, his shoulders hunched in defeat. He wasn't looking at her, and that hurt more than anything. It was as if he had already given up on her, on their family, before the storm had even fully broken. "Will," Carol's voice came out weak. The words caught in her throat. She couldn't keep the tremor from her voice. "How could you keep this from me? How could you hide this from me for so long?" Will didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her words right away. He simply stood there, his hands gripping the window ledge as if it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until Carol couldn't take it anymore. "Tell me the truth, Will," she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. "Who is the father? Why can't you tell me? Why can't you just say it?" He finally turned around, his face pale, his eyes filled with a sorrow that Carol had never seen before. He stepped towards her, but she instinctively pulled back, her body still processing the shock of his revelation. He looked as though he wanted to reach for her, but there was a hesitation in his movements, a distance that hadn't been there before. "I don't know who the father is," he said quietly, his words heavy with regret. "I don't know, Carol. I don't have any answers for you." The lack of clarity was maddening. Carol's mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. What had happened? How had she gotten pregnant with a child who wasn't Will's? The more she thought about it, the more the puzzle seemed unsolvable. Will took a step forward, and this time Carol didn't pull away. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears that she hadn't allowed herself to shed yet. "Then why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you come clean, Will? Why keep this secret?" "I couldn't," he said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't because I was afraid. Afraid that you would hate me, that you would leave me. And most of all, I was afraid of the truth. I was afraid of what it would mean for us, for you." Carol's anger flared. "You think hiding the truth is going to help? You think keeping secrets from me is going to protect me?" Her voice was rising now, the hurt and betrayal pushing her to the edge. "You've broken my trust, Will. I don't know who you are anymore." "I know," he whispered, stepping closer. "I know I've made a mistake. But please, Carol, you have to understand this wasn't something I planned. It wasn't something I wanted to happen." Carol wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "So what now, Will?" she asked, her voice filled with a painful calm. "What happens to us, to the baby? What do you expect me to do?" "I don't know," he said, his face etched with despair. "I really don't. I wish I had answers for you, but I don't. All I know is that I can't lose you. Carol, I love you, and I love our son, but I've messed everything up." Carol could feel the walls closing in around her. She had always believed in the idea of family, of love, of sticking together through thick and thin. But this was different. This was a betrayal that cut too deep. She didn't know how to respond to him, didn't know how to process the pain that was ripping through her heart. For the first time in a long time, Carol felt completely alone. She could hear her baby's soft cries in the background, a reminder that despite everything that had happened, she still had to care for him. She was his mother. She was the only one who could protect him from the hurt and the lies that had already started to infiltrate their lives. "I need some time," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think. I need to figure out what I'm supposed to do. I don't know if I can forgive you, Will. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her otherwise. Instead, he simply nodded, the weight of his own guilt pulling him further into himself. "I understand," he said softly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, Carol, whenever you're ready to talk." But Carol wasn't sure if she would ever be ready to talk to him again. She wasn't sure if she could ever look at him the same way. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had disappeared in an instant. In his place was someone who had chosen silence over honesty, secrecy over transparency, and fear over the love he had promised her. Will left the room without saying another word, leaving Carol alone with her thoughts and her broken heart. She stood there for a long time, staring at the door, her mind still racing. It felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. But more than that, she felt the weight of the choices she would have to make. Choices that could change the course of her life. Choices that could shape her future and her son's future. The silence in the room was deafening, and yet Carol knew that it wasn't the loudest thing she would have to face. The loudest thing would be the truth, the one she still wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Days passed, but the silence in Carol's house never lifted. Will had left, leaving behind nothing but a trail of unanswered questions and an overwhelming feeling of betrayal. Carol found herself drifting through each day, mechanically going through the motions of caring for her baby, but her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the web of lies and confusion that had shattered her sense of reality. The baby, so small and innocent, was a constant reminder of everything she had lost and everything that had been hidden from her. She watched him sleep, his little face peaceful and serene, and for a moment she wished she could find that same peace within herself. But peace was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Not when her entire world had been turned upside down. The more Carol tried to make sense of what Will had told her, the more her mind rebelled against the idea. "The baby isn't mine." Those words kept echoing in her head, each repetition tearing at her. How could she have been so blind? How could she have missed the signs, the lies? She had trusted Will with everything, her heart, her life, her future, and yet he had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. But even as she wrestled with the truth, something else began to stir inside her. A sense of anger, yes, but also a deep, burning need for answers. She couldn't keep running from the questions. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what had really happened, why Will had lied, and why the baby wasn't his. The days turned into nights, and Carol found herself alone with her thoughts more than ever. She didn't want to go out, didn't want to face the world. How could she? How could she show her face when everything she thought she knew was a lie? But on the 5th day after Will's departure, something snapped inside her. She could no longer sit in the silence, paralyzed by fear and confusion. She needed to know what had happened. She needed to know what her husband, her now ex-husband, was hiding. And she needed to know the truth about her son, the little boy she had sworn to protect with every ounce of her being. With trembling hands, Carol reached for her phone. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she had to reach out to someone who could help her make sense of the mess her life had become. She had no idea who to trust anymore, but there was one person she could think of, the one person who might have answers. Her best friend, Tanya. Tanya had been with her through everything, the highs and lows of life. The wedding, the pregnancy, the birth of her son. Tanya had been a constant source of support, someone Carol had always relied on. If there was anyone who could help her understand what had happened, it was Tanya. She dialed the number and waited as the phone rang. Each second felt like an eternity, but finally Tanya picked up. "Carol? Hey, are you okay?" Tanya's voice was soft, full of concern. "I've been trying to reach you. You haven't answered any of my texts. What's going on?" Carol paused, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. She hadn't told Tanya about what had happened between her and Will. She hadn't been ready. But now she realized that she couldn't keep this secret any longer. She needed help, and she needed to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. "Tanya, I need to talk to you," Carol said, her voice trembling. "There's so much I don't understand. Will, he's gone, and he told me something that I just can't wrap my head around." Tanya's tone immediately shifted to one of concern. "What happened, Carol? What did he say?" "He told me that our baby isn't his," Carol whispered, as if saying the words aloud would make the situation more real. "He said that the baby is not his, and that he doesn't know who the father is." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Carol could hear Tanya's sharp intake of breath, the shock and disbelief clear in her response. "What? No, that can't be true," Tanya finally managed to say. "Carol, are you sure he said that? Are you sure it wasn't just some kind of misunderstanding?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Carol admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to believe him, but the truth is, I don't know what to believe. He's the only man I've ever been with. But now I don't know if I can trust him." Tanya's voice softened, the compassion in her words a small comfort amidst the chaos. "Carol, listen to me. I don't know what happened between you and Will, but I do know this: you don't have to face this alone. I'm here for you. Whatever you need, I'll help you figure this out. We'll get to the bottom of it together." Carol felt a small flicker of relief in her chest at Tanya's words. She wasn't alone. For the first time in days, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could find a way through the darkness. But that didn't change the fact that her world had been shattered. It didn't change the fact that her son wasn't Will's, and that she had no idea who the father was or why Will had hidden the truth from her for so long. "Thank you, Tanya," Carol said, her voice shaky. "I need you. I need to know the truth. I can't keep living like this. I need to find out what really happened." "I'll be there as soon as I can," Tanya promised. "We'll figure it out together, and we'll get you the answers you need. You're not alone, Carol. I've got your back always." After they hung up, Carol sat in silence for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. The weight of what she had just shared with Tanya settled heavily on her shoulders. But despite the uncertainty and the pain, there was a small glimmer of hope that, with Tanya's help, she could begin to unravel the truth. Carol looked at her baby, his tiny face still peaceful in sleep, unaware of the storm that was brewing in his mother's heart. He was the one thing in her life that remained pure, untouched by the lies and the betrayal. And for him she would fight. She would fight to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be, because her son deserved that much. The days that followed were a blur. Tanya arrived the next morning, bringing with her the comfort that Carol so desperately needed. She had always been a steady presence in Carol's life, but now more than ever she felt like a lifeline, someone to hold on to in the midst of a storm that threatened to drown her. Carol couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly seen, but now with Tanya sitting beside her, her presence was like a balm to the wounds that had opened so painfully. Tanya didn't ask too many questions right away. Instead, she simply sat with Carol, offering her company and quiet support. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Sometimes just being there was enough. It wasn't until the following afternoon that Carol finally found the courage to tell Tanya everything. She explained the shock she had felt when Will confessed, the confusion and pain that had followed his revelation. She spoke of the nagging feeling in her chest, the sense that something had been off for months, but she had ignored the signs. "I don't even know where to start, Tanya," Carol confessed, her voice small. "I don't know who to trust anymore. I thought Will and I were a family that we could handle anything. But now everything feels like a lie." Tanya, ever the patient listener, nodded, absorbing every word without judgment. "I'm so sorry, Carol," she said softly, her hand resting gently on her friend's. "But you're not alone in this, and you're going to get through it. We'll figure this out. We'll get the answers you need." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Carol felt the faintest flicker of hope. Tanya's words gave her the strength to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could get through this. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, constantly questioning everything. She needed to know the truth, not just for herself, but for her baby, too. Her son deserved the truth, as hard as it might be to face. "I think I need to confront Will," Carol said, determination creeping into her voice. "I need to ask him why he lied, why he kept this from me. I don't care what he says, I need to hear it from his mouth. I need to know why my son isn't his." Tanya's expression softened, but she could see the fire in Carol's eyes. "Are you sure you're ready for that? It's not going to be easy. Carol, you have to be prepared for the fact that he may not give you the answers you want. Or maybe he'll say things that will hurt even more." "I don't care," Carol replied, her voice firm. "I don't care if it hurts. I need the truth." "I deserve the truth." Tanya nodded slowly. "All right. Then I'm with you every step of the way. We'll do this together." The two women made a plan. Carol would go to Will's apartment the next day. She had to do this, had to face him and demand answers. As much as it terrified her, it felt like the only way to move forward. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of his lies. That evening, Carol lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her baby slept soundly in the crib beside her, blissfully unaware of the storm raging in his mother's heart. Carol's hand rested on her son's tiny chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. He was so innocent, so pure, and it broke her heart to think of what kind of world he would grow up in. She had promised to protect him from pain, from betrayal, but already the cracks were beginning to show. The thought of confronting Will brought a sense of dread that curled in her stomach. She had loved him once, trusted him with everything. The idea of facing him again, of hearing his excuses, his justifications, felt almost unbearable. But she couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to face him, no matter how difficult it might be. The next morning she woke early, her heart pounding in her chest. Tanya was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. She had stayed the night, knowing that today would be a difficult one for Carol. She was there for her, ready to support her no matter what. "I'm ready," Carol said, walking into the kitchen where Tanya was standing. She felt her nerves tightening, but there was a sense of resolve in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I'm going to do it. I'm going to go see him." Tanya turned around and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, Carol. I'll go with you. I'll be there for you, no matter what happens." Carol smiled weakly. "Thanks, Tanya, but I think I need to do this on my own. I need to hear it from him. I need to look him in the eye when I ask him these questions." Tanya nodded. "Okay, but if you need me, just call me. I'll be right there." With a final nod, Carol grabbed her keys and headed out the door, Tanya's eyes following her as she walked to her car. Carol felt her pulse quicken as she drove toward Will's apartment. Every part of her wanted to turn around, to forget this whole thing, but she knew she couldn't. The truth was waiting for her, and no matter how much it hurt, she had to face it. When Carol arrived at Will's apartment building, she parked her car and sat for a moment. Taking a deep breath, she could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders, and for a moment she hesitated. Was she really ready for this? Was she truly prepared to face the man who had once been her everything? Her hand hovered over the door handle, and then, with a deep breath, she stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under her feet as she walked toward the entrance. She knocked on his door, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea how he would react, no idea what kind of answers he might give. But she knew one thing: she couldn't leave until she got the truth. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Will stood there, looking disheveled and weary, as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and something else, guilt, maybe. He opened his mouth to speak, but Carol didn't give him the chance. "I need to know the truth." "Will," she said, her voice steady, though her insides were in turmoil, "why did you lie to me? Why did you hide the truth about our son?" Will swallowed hard, and for a moment it seemed as if he might break. He looked down at the floor, then back at Carol, his face filled with regret. I never meant for it to happen like this," he whispered. Carol felt the anger surge within her. "Then tell me what happened, Will. Tell me why the baby isn't yours. I deserve to know." He took a deep breath before he finally spoke, his voice low and filled with pain. "I never wanted you to find out. I was scared, Carol. I was scared of losing you. But the truth is, I couldn't deny it. I couldn't keep pretending." The room felt smaller now, the air thicker. Carol took a step forward, her heart pounding. "Tell me everything," she demanded. "Tell me what happened. Who is the father?" Will stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of guilt and shame. Carol's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. And for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them was suffocating, a silence that had been years in the making. Carol's heart beat loudly in her chest, each thought a reminder of the hurt and confusion that had clouded her every thought since that night when Will had walked out of their home. "I never wanted you to find out like this, Carol," Will finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid of what it would do to us, to our family." Carol felt a surge of frustration rising within her, but she held it back. She had come here for answers, not to get caught up in his excuses. "Stop with the apologies, Will. Just tell me what happened. Why is the baby not yours? And why did you keep this from me?" Will ran a hand through his hair, looking at the floor. He seemed to be struggling, as if the words he needed to say were stuck somewhere deep inside him. Carol felt her patience thinning. She had been patient for too long. She had spent so much time thinking that the man she loved could do no wrong, but now all that trust felt like a distant memory. "I'm not proud of this," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "but I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. It was a mistake, a huge mistake." Carol's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer. "A mistake? A mistake? Will, I've been living in this lie for months, wondering why everything felt off. You owe me more than just an apology. You owe me the truth, the whole truth." Will met her gaze then, his eyes full of regret, but also a deep sadness. For a moment it seemed like he was trying to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. Finally he exhaled sharply, as if giving up the fight. I'm sorry, Carol. I never meant for it to go this far. But I wasn't the only one involved. The truth is, our son, he's not mine because I wasn't the one who got you pregnant. It was someone else." Carol's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to process the words he had just spoken. "What?" she whispered, the word coming out like a ghost of a sound. "Someone else? Who, Will? Who did you bring into our lives?" Will looked at her, his expression pained. It was a one-time thing, a mistake I made, a woman I met. She's the one who got you pregnant. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you, but I knew it would come out eventually." Carol's mind was spinning. The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment she felt as if she might collapse. Her whole world, the world she had built around Will, around their family, had just crumbled in a few short sentences. The anger she had been holding back surged like a tidal wave, threatening to drown her. "How could you do this?" she choked out, her voice trembling with fury. "How could you betray me like this? How could you bring someone else into our life, into my life, and then lie to me for all these months? You've been hiding this from me all this time?" Will's face was a mixture of guilt and fear. He took a tentative step toward her, but Carol held up a hand to stop him. "No, don't come any closer," she snapped, her chest rising and falling with each angry breath. "You don't get to touch me, Will. Not after this. Not after what you've done." His face fell, and for a moment he seemed to shrink, to become a shadow of the man he had once been. "I never meant for this to happen. I was selfish, Carol. I didn't think about what it would do to you, to us. I was just trying to escape from everything. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to face you after what I did." Carol's anger was now matched by a deep, hollow sense of betrayal. She had trusted Will with everything, with her heart, with her body, and he had shattered it all for a selfish moment of weakness. "Do you even understand what you've done?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Do you have any idea how much you've hurt me? How much you've hurt our son?" Will's face crumpled as he realized the weight of his actions. I don't know how to make this right, Carol. I know I can't take it back. I know I've ruined everything. I never wanted you to hate me." At those words, something inside Carol shifted. The anger didn't fade, but it was replaced by a deep sadness, a sadness that felt like it was swallowing her whole. She didn't know how she was supposed to move forward from here. She didn't know how to ever trust Will again. But one thing was certain. She couldn't raise her son in a house filled with lies. "I don't know what to do with this," she said, her voice small now. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. I don't even know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Will didn't respond. He just stood there, his head bowed, unable to offer her the comfort she so desperately needed. There were no easy answers, no magic words that could undo the damage he had done. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. "I need to go," Carol said quietly. "I need some time to think. I can't be here right now." Will nodded, though he didn't move to stop her. He couldn't, even if he wanted to. Carol turned away and walked out of his apartment, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had been ripped away. She felt like a stranger in her own life, a stranger in her own home. When Carol got back to her car, she collapsed into the seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel as tears streamed down her face. Her body shook with the force of her emotions. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something that could never be repaired. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Tanya. "Are you okay?" Carol stared at the screen, her chest tight, and then she typed a response. "No, I don't know how to be okay after this." The hours following Carol's confrontation with Will passed in a blur. She drove aimlessly, unable to focus on anything except the crushing weight of his words. The reality of his confession kept replaying in her mind, each repetition carving deeper scars into her heart. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the shame, the guilt, the hurt, but she couldn't shake the image of her baby's face either. The little boy who she had sworn to protect, to shield from the ugliness of the world. And now here she was, standing in the aftermath of a betrayal that went beyond anything she had ever imagined. Tanya's messages kept coming, but Carol ignored them. She wasn't ready to talk, not yet. The storm inside her was too wild, too fierce for words. She needed time to process, to breathe, to figure out what came next. But what did come next? She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle whatever life threw her way. But this was different. This wasn't something she could just power through. This was a betrayal of everything she had built, everything she had believed in. The car came to a stop at a park near the outskirts of town, a place she used to visit when she wanted to be alone with her thoughts. She sat there for a long time, the engine still running, the radio off, her hands clenched around the wheel. The sound of children playing in the distance seemed to mock her, each laugh, each shout of joy, a reminder of the innocence she was trying so desperately to protect. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she answered. Tanya? Carol's voice was hoarse, her words thick with emotion. Carol, where are you? I've been so worried. Tanya's voice was soft, laced with concern. I'm at the park. I just needed to be alone for a while, Carol replied, her eyes staring blankly ahead. She could feel the tears building up again, but she held them back. She wouldn't cry, not now. You don't have to be alone. Carol, you can't go through this by yourself, Tanya said gently. I'm here. I'm right here, whenever you're ready. Carol closed her eyes, biting back the wave of emotion that threatened to drown her. I don't know what to do anymore, Tanya. I just don't know. He's ruined everything. I don't even know who he is anymore. He's not the man I thought he was. Tanya's voice softened even more, becoming almost a whisper. I know it's hard, but you're going to get through this. You've always been strong, Carol. You don't need him. You don't need anyone who would betray you like that. Carol's hand trembled on the phone, and for a moment she wished she could just erase everything that had happened. Wished she could go back to the days when she and Will had been a family, when everything had felt safe and secure. But that was gone. It was never going to be the same. I don't know if I can forgive him, Carol said quietly, her voice cracking. I don't know if I can ever look at him the same way again. He lied to me. He lied to us. I know, Tanya replied, and you don't have to forgive him right now or ever if you don't want to. What matters is what you need, Carol. What's best for you? The words hung in the air for a moment, and Carol let them sink in. What was best for her? What did she need? She needed answers. She needed to understand why Will had done this, why he had allowed her to live in a lie for so long. But more than that, she needed to protect her son. She needed to protect the one thing that had never betrayed her love for him. You're right, Carol said finally, her voice steadier now. I need to focus on what's best for me and for my son. I need to get my life back. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep letting him control my happiness. Tanya didn't say anything at first, but Carol could hear the relief in her friend's voice. That's the first step, Carol. You've already started to take control. And I'll be here every step of the way, no matter what. Carol took a deep breath, looking out at the children playing in the distance. She envied their carefree joy. She longed for that kind of peace, but it would come. She would make it come. I'm going to talk to Will again, Carol said, her voice firm now. I need to hear it from him, why he did this. I need him to tell me the truth, the whole truth. I can't let him just walk away from this. Tanya's voice softened again. Are you sure you're ready for that? I have to be, Carol said, more to herself than to Tanya. I can't keep wondering. I need closure. I need to know what kind of man I've been living with. Then I'll be right here when you're ready. Just don't do this alone, Carol. You've got people who love you. Carol didn't respond immediately. She just sat in the silence, letting Tanya's words wash over her. For the first time since the confrontation, Carol felt a sense of clarity. She knew what she had to do. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of Will's lies. She couldn't let his mistakes define her life anymore. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, Carol finally started her car again. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. She was ready to face it. She was ready to reclaim her life, her power, and her future. and no matter what came next, she would do it on her own terms. The truth had come crashing down, but now it was time to rebuild. The drive back to Will's apartment was a blur. Carol's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached, but the pain was almost comforting, grounding her in a way that her swirling emotions could not. She had spent the last few hours trying to sort through everything that had happened, to make sense of the puzzle pieces that were now scattered across her life. But no matter how many times she replayed the conversation in her head, no matter how many different outcomes she imagined, one thing was clear: she needed answers. She couldn't keep walking around in this fog of uncertainty. Will had to face the consequences of his actions, and she had to face him. As Carol pulled into the parking lot of the building, her heart began to race. She could feel the familiar sting of betrayal, that sharp ache in her chest, but there was also something else now. Something that had been buried under the layers of hurt and confusion. It was determination. The kind of determination that only came when you were at your lowest point and had nothing left to lose. She wasn't going to walk away from this without getting the truth. She wasn't going to let him continue hiding behind his lies. She parked the car, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The cool evening air hit her face, the breeze a brief reprieve from the weight of the moment. She knew she was walking into a storm. The conversation with Will wouldn't be easy. It never had been. But this time it wasn't just about their relationship. This time it was about everything. It was about trust, about lies, about her son, about her future. Carol's footsteps were steady as she made her way toward the building's entrance. When she reached the elevator, she pressed the button for Will's floor. The small space felt suffocating, the silence inside it a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in her mind. As the elevator ascended, she ran through the conversation in her head, trying to prepare herself for what was to come. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped out into the hallway. Will's apartment was at the end, the door slightly ajar. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. She had come here for one thing: the truth. As she approached the door, she hesitated for a moment, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. She had loved this man. She had built her life with him, dreamed of a future with him. And now here she was, standing on the edge of it all, ready to confront him. The weight of that finality settled heavily in her chest. She pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted her made her pause. Will was standing in the middle of the living room, his back to her, his shoulders hunched as if he had been waiting for this moment. He turned around when he heard the door open. His eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Carol," he said softly, his voice low and uncertain, "I wasn't sure you were going to come." "I had to," Carol replied, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "I need to hear it from you, Will. I need to hear the truth, all of it." Will took a step toward her, but Carol held up her hand, stopping him. She wasn't ready for his touch, not yet. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready again. She had to keep control of the situation. She couldn't let him manipulate her again. "Why did you do it?" Carol asked, her voice rising slightly. "Why did you lie to me for so long? Why didn't you tell me the truth from the start? How could you keep something like this from me?" Will's face fell, the guilt washing over him like a tide. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. He looked like a man lost, drowning in his own regret. Finally, he found his voice. "I was scared, Carol, scared of what it would do to us. I didn't know how to tell you, and when I realized what had happened, I didn't know how to fix it. I thought if I just kept pretending, if I just kept living like everything was okay, it would go away. But it never did." "Pretend?" Carol repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You thought you could just pretend? Pretend that everything was okay while I was left in the dark, carrying this weight on my shoulders alone? You thought that was the answer?" "I don't know," Will said, his voice breaking. "I was selfish. I know that now. I didn't think about you. I didn't think about the consequences of my actions. I didn't know how to deal with it." Carol shook her head, the disbelief still fresh in her mind. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All this time, all the lies, all the manipulation, it had been because he was too selfish to face the truth, too afraid to deal with the fallout of his own mistakes. She had given him everything. She had trusted him with her heart, with her family, and he had thrown it all away. "You think I'm just going to forgive you because you're sorry?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "You think that's enough? After everything you've done, after the years of lies and betrayal?" Wood didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes filled with regret and something else, something that looked like desperation. Carol saw it, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the man he had once been, the man she had loved. But it didn't matter anymore. That man was gone. The truth had torn him apart, and there was no going back. "I can't fix this, Carol," Will said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't undo what I've done. I know I've lost you. I know I've lost everything." Carol's heart ached at the rawness of his words, but the pain she felt wasn't for him. It was for her son. It was for the future that had been stolen from them. It was for the life she had dreamed of that would never be the same again. "No, you can't fix it," Carol said, her voice quiet now. "But you can make it right. You can take responsibility. You can own what you did, Will, and you can never lie to me again. You can never lie to our son again." "I need to protect him. I need to protect myself." Will didn't say anything. He just nodded, his face pale and his eyes filled with sorrow. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been spoken and the damage was done. "I'm leaving, Will," Carol said, her voice firm. "I don't know what the future holds for me, but I do know this. I won't be part of your lies anymore. I won't live in the shadow of your mistakes." She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps heavy with finality. As she stepped out into the hallway, she felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. But there was something else now. A glimmer of hope. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could start again, on her own terms. The door clicked shut behind her, and Carol took a deep breath. She had faced the storm. She had confronted Will, and now, for the first time in a long while, she could breathe again. The night air was crisp, and the darkness wrapped around Carol like a protective blanket as she made her way back to her car. Her mind was still reeling from the conversation with Will, but as she reached the driver's side door, something inside her shifted. It wasn't relief, exactly not, yet, but it was a kind of quiet certainty. For the first time in what felt like forever, Carol had made a decision that was completely hers. No one had forced her hand, no one had pressured her. She had confronted the truth, painful and ugly as it was, and now it was time to move forward. As she drove away from the apartment building, she didn't know exactly where she was going, but she didn't care. She didn't need a destination. She needed space to breathe, to think, to clear her head. The weight of everything that had happened was still heavy on her shoulders, but it was a different kind of weight now. It was no longer the burden of a secret, of a lie. It was the weight of something she could finally control. Her future. She drove through the quiet streets, her mind drifting from one thought to the next. She thought about her son, about the life she wanted for him, about the future she had dreamed of. She thought about Will, about how he had broken her heart, how he had shattered their family with his lies, but also about how she had stood her ground, how she had demanded the truth even when it hurt. And in that moment, she realized something else. She was stronger than she had ever known, stronger than Will had ever given her credit for. She found herself on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood she had driven past countless times, but never really seen. There was a small park up ahead, and as she pulled into the parking lot, she couldn't help but feel drawn to it. The calm, the solitude, the peace, it was what she needed. She parked the car and got out, her feet crunching on the gravel as she walked toward the playground. The park was empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing that broke the silence. She sat down on one of the benches, taking a deep breath as she gazed out at the empty playground. The quiet was soothing. It gave her space to think, to breathe. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she took it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen. It was Tanya. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether she was ready to talk. But then she pressed the answer button, bringing the phone to her ear. "Hey!" Tanya's voice was warm, a familiar comfort after the storm of the last few hours. "How are you holding up?" Carol let out a long breath, her shoulders relaxing as she settled into the bench. "I'm okay, a little better, I think. I'm still processing everything, but I'm okay." "I'm glad to hear that," Tanya said, her tone soft but knowing. "I know it's not easy, but I'm proud of you, Carol. You did what needed to be done." Carol smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I never thought I'd be able to do it, but I had to, for myself, for my son." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Carol could almost hear Tanya thinking, "You're going to be okay, Carol. I know you're hurting, but this is just the beginning of something new. You're not alone in this. You've got people who love you." "I know," Carol said quietly, "and I'm starting to see that. For so long I let myself believe that I couldn't make it without Will. But now I realize I don't need him. I never needed him the way I thought I did." Tanya's voice softened. "You're stronger than you know, Carol. You've always been. And you're going to come out of this even stronger." Carol closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She had spent so many years living in the shadow of someone else's decisions, but now she was standing in the light of her own. She was choosing herself. She was choosing her future. "I'm scared, Tanya," Carol admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what comes next. I don't know what the future holds, and that terrifies me." "I know it's scary," Tanya replied, her voice steady and reassuring. "But you don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take it one step at a time. And know that whatever happens, you're going to be okay." Carol let out a shaky breath, a weight she didn't even know she was carrying slowly lifting off her chest. "I've been living in fear for so long," she said, almost to herself. "Afraid of being alone, afraid of making the wrong choice. But I'm done with that. I'm done letting fear control me." "That's the first step," Tanya said with a smile in her voice. "You're already doing it. And I'll be right here with you every step of the way." Carol stood up from the bench, her feet solid beneath her. The wind had picked up, the cool air brushing against her face. But for the first time in a long while she didn't feel cold. She felt free, free from the past, free from the lies, free from the weight of the decisions that had never been hers to make. "Thank you, Tanya," Carol said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "I'm just a phone call away," Tanya replied. "Always." Carol smiled, a real smile now, the kind that came from deep within her. "I'm going to figure this out. I don't know how, but I will. I'm not going to let fear control me anymore. I'm going to do this for me, and for my son." As she hung up the phone and slipped it into her pocket, Carol felt a sense of peace settle over her. The storm that had raged inside her for so long was beginning to calm. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more challenges ahead, more questions to answer, more pain to endure. But she was ready, ready to face it head on, ready to rebuild her life on her own terms. She took a final look at the park, the quiet stretching out before her. It was a symbol of what lay ahead, an open space full of possibility waiting for her to step into it. And for the first time in a long time she felt hopeful. It had been weeks since Carol's confrontation with Will, and though the pain hadn't disappeared entirely, it had become more manageable. Each day felt like a new step, a new opportunity to rebuild, to move forward. There were still moments when the weight of everything threatened to pull her under the loneliness, the worry about the future, the lingering questions about what had gone wrong. But they no longer consumed her. Slowly the fog was lifting. She'd moved out of Will's apartment. The transition had been difficult at first, so much had happened in such a short time, but she had kept her head above water. She had taken control of her life again. The little apartment she had rented was small, but it was hers. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. Every morning, when she walked out onto the small balcony and felt the warm sunlight on her face, she was reminded of just how far she had come. She had found peace in the simplest of things. The way her son laughed when they played together, the quiet comfort of a cup of coffee in the morning, the calmness of walking through the park on her own. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was all that mattered. Will had tried to reach out, of course. He'd sent text messages, left voicemails, even tried to visit her at her new apartment. But Carol had remained firm. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. Maybe not ever. The betrayal was still too fresh, the scars too deep. But she had done something important in that moment. She had stopped letting him control her. She had stopped letting him occupy space in her heart and mind. It wasn't easy, but she was learning to let go. One afternoon, as Carol was picking up groceries, she ran into an old friend from work, someone she hadn't seen in years. The familiarity of the face, the warmth of the greeting, the ease of the conversation, it all felt like a small but important sign. A reminder that life was still moving forward, even when she felt like she was standing still. They had lunch together at a small cafe, and the conversation was easy, free of the heaviness that had defined so much of her recent life. Her friend had asked how things were going with Will, and Carol had simply smiled, shaking her head. "I'm not sure what the future holds," Carol had said, "but I know I'm not going to let anyone else make decisions for me anymore. I'm done with that." Her friend had looked at her with admiration, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "You've got this, Carol. You've always had it in you." Carol had felt a lump rise in her throat, a mixture of gratitude and emotion. She hadn't realized until that moment just how much she had been carrying, how much of herself she had buried in the years of trying to please others, of trying to make things work for everyone except herself. But now she could see it, the strength she had always possessed, the resilience that had carried her through the darkest moments. That evening, after she had put her son to bed, Carol sat by the window and watched the sunset, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange. She thought about everything she had been through, the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, but also the love, the support, the courage that had kept her going. She thought about Will, about the life they had built together, and how it had all come crashing down. But she also thought about how she had risen from it, and for the first time in a long time she felt truly at peace. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Tanya. "Hey, just wanted to check in on you. How are you doing?" Carol smiled as she read the message, a sense of warmth spreading through her. Tanya had been there for her through it all, a constant source of strength. She was the friend who had never judged her, who had always supported her, even when Carol couldn't see the way forward. She was the person who had reminded her that there was still hope, still light at the end of the tunnel. Carol typed her reply, "I'm doing better. It's still a journey, but I'm taking it one day at a time. I'm starting to find my way again." Tanya's response came quickly. "That's what matters, one step at a time. And remember, I'm here, always." Carol put the phone down and looked out the window once more. The sky had darkened now, the stars beginning to twinkle in the night. She felt a quiet sense of pride, a realization that she was no longer the woman who had been trapped in the past, trapped by someone else's choices. She was stronger, wiser, more whole than she had ever been, and the future, her future, was wide open. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, but Carol was no longer afraid. She knew that she could face whatever came her way. She had already conquered the hardest part, finding herself again, and that was more than enough. The sound of her son's soft breathing from the other room brought a smile to Carol's face. He was her reason, her light in the darkness, the constant reminder of the love that had never faltered. She was going to give him everything she had, everything she could, to make sure he grew up strong, confident, and free. With that thought, Carol closed her eyes, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The storm had passed. The journey was far from over, but it was hers now, and that was all she needed.